Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jack Batten, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's debate between Mr. Josh Hammer and Dr. Gregory Huber on the policy of assisted suicide. Nope, on the resolution resolved, America's ruling class has failed. Wrong script. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of our free speech. Now for our guests. Josh Hammer is Senior Editor-at-Large of Newsweek, a syndicated columnist, and a fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation and the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. He also hosts The Josh Hammer Show, a Newsweek podcast and syndicated radio show. A frequent pundit and essayist on political, legal, and cultural issues, Josh is a constitutional attorney by training and additionally serves as senior counsel for the Article 3 Project. He is the author of the new book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Josh is a college campus speaker through Young America's Foundation and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and a law school campus speaker through the Federalist Society. Josh graduated from Duke University, where he majored in economics, and from the University of Chicago Law School. He lives in Florida with his wife and daughter, and also remains an active member of the State Bar of Texas. Dr. Gregory Huber is the Forst Family Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at Yale, where he also directs the Center for the Study of American Politics. His research is broadly concerned with mass and elite politics in the United States, and his prior teaching includes crime and punishment, introduction to American government, American political economy, and American political behavior. He holds a BA and MA from Emory University and a PhD from Princeton. Please join me in welcoming our guest. Just a quick note on our format this afternoon. Each guest will deliver 5 minutes of opening remarks, starting with Mr. Hammer. Then each guest will deliver a 2-minute rebuttal, moving on to a period of open questions from the audience. And we will end with 2-minute closing statements from each guest. Mr. Hammer, the stage is yours.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I was here 3 years ago for a different Buckley debate, so really wonderful to be back. So I hope those of you did not come expecting kind of like a fiery Mike Tyson style knockout blow here. I think this will be more of an amicable debate, but I'm delighted to be framing in the affirmative tonight and argue that the ruling class has indeed failed. So part of this kind of it ends up becoming a bit of a definition, right? I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I like to define things. So what actually is the American ruling class? So once upon a time, the ruling class was a distinctly Marxist concept, this notion of kind of a ruling class, the plebeians, the proletariat, and so forth there. But the specific term ruling class kind of took on a newfound distinction with a 2010 essay from the late, great conservative public intellectual Angelo Codevilla, who had kind of one of the defining essays of the 2010-2011 Tea Party movement. And he started to identify what he referred to as the post-fall of the Berlin Wall ruling class. So I was born in 1989. I was born actually the year that the Berlin Wall fell. And I would like to suggest to you that this actually is kind of the definition, the conception of the ruling class that we ought to think about and that we ought to consider there. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall ushers in what was known in D.C. policy wonk circles at the time as the so-called Washington Consensus. This was the idea that to kind of borrow from Francis Fukuyama and to kind of play and mix and match metaphors here, that the era of nationalism was over and that the era of globalization was here to stay. This is kind of the era of the so-called golden arches theory of global economics, this notion that two countries that have a McDonald's, aka golden arches, will never go to war with one another. The Russia-Ukraine war, among other conflicts, has completely smattered this theory to shreds. And to get one kind of pithy statement of kind of the economic components of the Washington Consensus and this notion of this bipartisan ruling class, I often think back to this quotation from a George H.W. Bush White House economist by the name of Michael Boskin, who famously or perhaps infamously said, one time he said, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? It's Ricardo comparative advantage either way there. And I would like to suggest to you that when it comes to national security, when it comes to just the notion that America should not be overly dependent on its foes, its enemies here, that the potato chip, computer chip, what's the difference theory has utterly and catastrophically failed. It has been imbibed like mother's milk by elites of both parties for a very long time now. This is the ruling class ideology insofar as you can really discern and identify individuals who go to various gatekeeping institutions. Frankly, Yale University is probably a paradigmatic example of one such institution there, who come out and oftentimes on the other side, not always, present company excluded, but oftentimes on the other side end up kind of touting the very similar talking points of this ideology there, this globalist ideology there. But we saw the pitfalls of this economic globalization, among other things, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it quickly became obvious that America was overly dependent on the Chinese Communist Party, our arch geopolitical foe this century, for such basic things as PPE, personal protective equipment. Something like 85 to 90% of the pharmaceutical materials, the ingredients in various pharmaceuticals, something like 85 to 90% of them, depending on the pharmaceutical, are oftentimes made in China. More generally speaking, the fact that we're even having a foreign policy discussion about whether or not America should go to war in the case that China invades Taiwan, this is largely being done because Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company is the most impressive and important semiconductor company in the entire world. They have something like a 35 to 40% market share, if not higher, when it comes to 3 nanometer and smaller chips, the most advanced chips currently on Earth there. This is all due to short-sighted computer chip, potato chip, what's the difference style of economic thinking there. But it's not just economic theory, I think, that is the reason why the ruling class has failed. I can certainly point also to the shortcomings of the COVID-19 pandemic. You guys have all lived through it. I certainly lived through it there. Here we saw basically just a bunch of power-hungry tyrants. I mean, that's essentially what we saw. I'm not really going to sugarcoat it or frankly mince words there. When we were looking at people in the public health bureaucracies of this country that put lockdowns in place, that implemented extraordinarily strenuous masking and vaccination regimes there, all of which was completely untested over the protestations of those courageous heroes like Dr. J. Bhattacharya, who signed the Great Barrington Declaration early on in the pandemic and have since been vindicated there. We are not going to know for a very long time, probably decades, we are not going to know just how much we lost actually during that pandemic when it comes to children who lost years of their lives socializing there. Literally, lives were ruined, or at least years of lives ruined. That all, too, was due to this insidious ruling class ideology. But perhaps most fundamentally here, the reason why the ruling class has failed is because the ruling class has failed to grapple with the fact that America is a 50-50 divided country. We are extraordinarily politically divided, as every single election makes very clear. But the ruling class subscribes to a monolithic political ideology, an ideology of free movement of labor, capital, humans, and frankly, a more libertarian-leaning ideology more generally of free minds and free individuals and just free everything there. The problem is that when you actually poll the American people, that doesn't necessarily poll well with people out there in so-called flyover country. People don't necessarily believe in the various kind of snapshot phraseologies and kind of the pithy catchphrases of the ruling class institutions there. So in not capturing the sentiments of the American people, they are only then driving the people towards lesser institutions outside of their gatekeeping talons. They are driving them to further and further darker corners of the web, ironically then setting themselves up for radicalization, whereas they are actually themselves often to blame for it, for not adequately representing the full panoply of viewpoints there. So, it's a bit of a whirlwind opening statement, obviously, but 5 minutes is only 5 minutes, so thank you guys.
So this brings back memories of high school debate, which I'm a fair bit older than my debate partner here, so it was well before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I remember watching on TV. The high point of which was that Roger Waters promised to come and perform The Wall by Pink Floyd at the Berlin Wall if the wall came down. So it seems to me, just to begin, to say that it's extremely important to have debates about what it would mean for a ruling class to fail and to engage in a serious intellectual discussion about how we would know what it would mean for there to be a failure. And there are a variety of points that were raised in the previous speech. And so I don't want to dive too deeply into them at this moment, because I think it would be interesting to hear from the audience about things like, what is an alternative to a globalist economy? What would it mean for the United States to do everything itself rather than engage in trade? But I have a few different reactions that I thought of before hearing what was going to be said. My first comment is, I don't think there's a ruling class in America. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting about it, if you compare our university system, our employment system, our educational system to Europe, for example, is how remarkably open and fluid the American political system is and what it means to lead. And I think this is a feature of it. And if you were to, in fact, characterize what's going on in both political parties right now, you would probably say that the populists have won in both parties. And by populists, I mean people who would have been excluded from the orthodox leadership of both parties 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, I think part of that reflects economic dislocation associated globalization, but it also reflects economic dislocation associated with computerization and mechanization, so that even if there were no global trade, we would still see ourselves in a world in which the returns to a high school diploma for a working age man have collapsed dramatically, even in the absence of trade. And that economy is shaping politics. And then the second thing I thought a little bit about is simply the fact that American political leadership is a they, not an it. And one way to think about this is to just pick up the newspaper and look at what it means to understand what's going on in the current presidential administration. And what you find yourself reading is that it isn't a leadership, it is a contested leadership. And so I made a list of coalitions that I can think of in the current presidential leadership, which suggests that a ruling class is not actually a ruling class, but a ruling coalition. So we have rich libertarian tech bros, we have isolationists, we have Zionists of different flavors, we have anti-labor, we have anti-abortion groups, we have deficit hawks, we have anti-tax conservatives, and by the way, the anti-deficit and anti-tax people may not be the same people. We have those who are in favor of protectionism and more American independence. We have those who are against immigration. We have people who would like to walk back DEI. And we have moderates. So there are a whole variety of individuals, and to call that group the ruling class, I think, is to miss the fact that they disagree. And this is not just a feature of the current presidential administration, it's a feature of most every presidential administration in the last 2 decades, and it's interesting. And it's interesting because I don't think there is a consensus on the things we're fighting about within or across parties. So these are not solely conflicts between the left and the right, but within the left and the right. And then third, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a political scientist, so I like to think a lot about what it would mean to say that something is a failure. And so just think what that would mean. So one possibility is they've ever failed. Well, of course, everyone fails all the time. And so it's the wrong thing to say, has the ruling class ever failed? That's not the right metric. I think the question is, do they do better than they do elsewhere in the world? And would you choose to abandon a system that we think of as relatively meritocratic, that generates expertise in people with ambition to lead, and a political system that we think promotes people on average who desire to serve others to be effective in governance? And my sense is that the system does reasonably well. It's not that it doesn't make mistakes. We can think of the emerging consensus that there's probably too much globalization, that it leaves us vulnerable to exploitation in the case of economic disruptions. That's a consensus that I think actually both left and right have moved the other direction. And so I think the ruling class tends to learn, but I also think it's the right way to assess whether or not something is a failure is not to point out things that we don't like in particular, but to integrate over the whole distribution of problems that society faces. And I would agree with the point that part of the problem is that we are closely divided. But I think that's a misnomer there, or it's a mistake to focus on the things we disagree about to assume that politics has failed. 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, we might have sat in this room and had a vigorous debate about whether or not women and people of color should be at Yale. That's what we would have fought about. We don't fight about that anymore. Now, what do we learn from that? We learn that we stop fighting about things that we agree about. And so when we say that American politics is heavily contested, it's heavily contested on the things that we as a society are still working our way through. And I think that's a feature, not a bug. So I think I'll leave it at that, other than to say there are lots of things that we don't like in politics, and I think it's wrong to assess a failure based on specific policies or specific instances without thinking about the whole set of things and the alternative arrangements that we might have.
2 minutes? Look, I mean, I told you guys this wouldn't necessarily be kind of like a fiery, MMA style of fight, and I think I probably properly set your expectations. I mean, just a couple of things there. One, I probably should just clarify there, my stance is not one of economic autarky. My stance is certainly not that America should not engage in trade. Rather, my stance is that multilateral trade deals, more generally speaking, have oftentimes done more long-term harm than short-term good. More generally speaking, when I speak of this so-called Washington consensus, this post-Berlin Wall era of the golden arches theory, where trade maximization was really favored at all expenses there, the thing that I think what I keep on referring to as a ruling class has tended to forget is that price minimization is not the only thing that matters there. There are genuine other competing concerns there. Like, consumer surplus is a thing, as anyone who's taken Econ 101 can attest. So are producer concerns, production, manufacturing, supply chain integrity there. These are actual genuine concerns there that I do think that our monolithic elites have tended to very much not properly think about there. Furthermore, I didn't even mention foreign policy. I mean, I guess I would probably be remiss, frankly, if I didn't talk at least a little bit about our various foreign policy failures there. I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, the moralistic boondoggles in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were obviously absolutely horrific failures, done in the absolutely, frankly, patently insane notion that we could craft Madisonian-style democracies out of either Arab, in the case of Iraq, or just Taliban overridden, mountainous Taliban-infested countries like Afghanistan there. So our foreign policy has been, frankly, just an utter shambles for the past 30 years since this era of ruling class rule has come in. That's gone over both parties, by the way. It's not just the GOP. Barack Obama's disastrous intervention in Libya has resulted in a jihadist civil war that is still tearing that country asunder to this day. So foreign policy, I think, is very much a big piece of this puzzle as well there. I guess the point is, though, and maybe this is probably one of the areas of disagreement between Greg and I do think that you can actually discern a ruling class ideology. That really kind of is my claim there. And this ruling class ideology, again, is predicated on calling a lot of things free. Free minds, free movement of capital, free movement of labor, free borders, open borders there. This notion that, as George W. Bush put it in his second inaugural address, where he infamously espoused the so-called freedom agenda, that people all throughout the world aspire to the same utopian, universalist, Lockean, Jeffersonian conception of liberty there. I'm not entirely sure how many people he's met in countries like Afghanistan that he actually said those words. So it's this notion there that human beings can be reduced to widgets on an economic chalkboard there. That really kind of is the ruling class ideology at its core, whether it's immigration, labor, trade, foreign policy, or all the above. That, frankly, above all, is what I object to.
So I guess I would if I was just going to summarize an area where I think we disagree, it probably wouldn't be on the substance of whether or not some of these particular ideas have proven ill-suited. For example, we now know that at the time of the decision about whether or not to invade Iraq, that the State Department walked in and said, you can't knock down a government without a plan to replace it. What plan do we have to replace these institutions? Now, in one sense, we could say the ruling class is the people in power at that moment, so it was the Bush administration. But there was substantial internal debate, we now know, between Condoleezza Rice and people on one side and other people in the more, relatively hawkish, and other people in the more State Department side about, internal to the State Department, about what the right way to win a war was for the long term. And so I think we see, I guess what I would say is that I don't discern a particular consensus on some of these things across parties or within parties. I think factions became dominant at one period of time. And I think, therefore, my central disagreement would probably be whether or not there is a single ruling class view on many of these issues. The other thing that I think has happened is that we have seen learning take place. And this is something where you're seeing an understanding that many of the decisions that we thought were free lunches, for example, trade reduces prices, everyone's happy, things are cheaper at Walmart, has a series of other consequences that we're beginning to think about. But just to talk about how contested that is, there is a robust debate in economics now, just an empirical debate, not a normative debate, about whether or not what would happen if all the manufacturing jobs that allegedly had been moved overseas were brought back? How many people would you employ? And the answer is not nearly as many as you imagine, because the nature of manufacturing has changed dramatically. And so it's not that we shouldn't admit that there have been substantial failures and substantial mistakes made. I think that's a feature of any political system. The question would be whether or not we would think about things like the post-war consensus about how the United States approaches international aid and about how the United States approaches international security in Europe. Would we count those as failures, or would we say that there are failures and there are successes? And so my central, I think, response would simply be, we want to be careful about selecting on the dependent variable. You don't just want to focus on failures without thinking about all the successes before you were to arrive at some sort of synoptic overview about has a ruling class failed. And one way in which we could say that the ruling class would fail is if it didn't adapt, if it didn't learn. And yet the world has changed, and in many ways we've seen adaptation taking place. It perhaps is inefficient, but that's a feature, not a bug, of American politics and the American political system. It's not designed to be quick. It's designed to be robust and hard to take over. That's it.
Thank you very much to you both. I'll just start off our Q&A with a brief question for you, Dr. Huber. So you argued that America does not have a ruling class. Do you think America is in danger of developing a sort of ruling class? Like, I think back to President Biden's speech toward the end of his term in office, where he warned against the formation of an oligarchy, was his word, in American government. Do you think we are in danger of forming an oligarchic sort of ruling class, in whatever sort of form it might take?
I think the interesting question of whether or not, and I think that's a reference to wealthy people in the private sector participating in government. And if you read back through American political history, it's a pretty common thing. And in fact, to imagine that it wasn't the case, that there were people who were successful in the private sector being involved in government, I think the particular Biden complaint, and it's a very Biden complaint, is it's a particular set of oligarchs as opposed to another set of oligarchs who are involved on the left. So if we get to alternate regimes and we get to alternate sets of oligarchs, that sounds like competitive democracy. I think there's a different set of concerns, which is whether or not people are bringing private money to bear in government operations. You could have concerns about disproportionate speech. It's difficult to figure out how you would regulate that in a fair way. But you might also have simple concerns about corruption, as if people who are doing business with the government are also seeking to influence. But in general, I would dismiss that as campaign rhetoric.
Thank you. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and Max and I will be over to you. Yeah, right here. If you could stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Shao. I'm a doctoral student here in political science. My question is more from Josh. Sorry, it's kind of blocked. So I wanted to probe you a little bit about what you mean by the ruling class ideology, because you said two things which seem to me pretty contradictory. The first is that they're classically libertarian, free everything, but you also said that the other one's imposing draconian vaccination and mask mandates and lockdowns. How do you make sense of the two? How do they both describe the working class at the same time? They're both libertarian, but they're also like tyrants.
Great question. It's kind of an interesting question that I sometimes debate among my conservative friends, actually, is what happened to libertarianism as a political movement during the COVID-19 lockdowns. I mean, some of the more public-facing libertarians that I was able to identify were actually some of the biggest proponents of the COVID-19 lockdowns, which actually struck me as, to the point of your question, as profoundly hypocritical there. Look, I think the COVID-19 instance, you're right, I think it does undermine my broader thesis, but it probably can be reconciled insofar as the following are concerned. At some point between the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is kind of where I start my history here with this development of this modern ruling class there, at some point there, this ideology came to dominate really large swaths of pretty much all of the major institutions in the United States, whether that is academia, whether that is the media, whether that is Hollywood, big tech, Wall Street, you name it, and so forth there. And certainly the medical establishment is absolutely part of that there. We saw that over and over again when it came to things like the DSM and frankly how they would change and alter some of their of their diseases or their previous kind of social maladies based on changing political winds and so forth there. So at some point, it seems to me, and I'm kind of thinking this through in real time, it's frankly a very good question, but it seems to me that libertarianism, again, this notion of free minds, free markets, free movement of capital, whatever, which really is kind of a sine qua non of this ruling class ideology. Again, whether you want to call it neoliberalism, libertarianism, at some point it becomes kind of a blurring of the lines. But this notion of freedom there came to so, I think, exalt the institutions because they came to so dominate them that they probably overly deferred to the medical authorities at that time. That's my best guess. Because it is a fair question, but again, empirically speaking, as someone who was very closely following this at the time there, it's literally still something that my friends and I joke about to this day, is that many of the people who kind of proudly call themselves libertarians were completely MIA and totally not found during COVID. Now there were exceptions. There totally were exceptions. Rand Paul, for instance, from Kentucky, frankly, not necessarily my favorite senator, but he is a self-described libertarian or libertarian-leaning Republican, I guess you would say, and he was outspoken. So there totally were exceptions, but overall, what I just spat out of my mouth is probably the best I could do as far as a guess. It's actually a very good question, frankly. Yeah.
Further questions?
Thank you. Thank you both. I'd like your thoughts on one possible contributing cause of what I agree is ruling class failure. I think they're exemplified in three progressive policy areas of immigration and green energy mandates. I'm forgetting the third one. I'll remember in a minute. Because what I think those show is that you have issues that are very popular in the upper middle classes and the classes that wield political power, but they wreak very harsh negative effects on people in the middle and working classes in this country. And so my suggestion is that one reason our ruling class doesn't do so well is because they're completely insulated from the adverse consequences of many of their policies, especially on the progressive side. It's the so-called no skin in the game problem. I think that's important. I'd like your thoughts on it. And whether I suggest remedies like maybe we need more robust federalism to bring decision-making back to where people can feel the consequences of their own decisions.
You want to go first or one?
I mean, I'm happy to speculate a little bit. Actually, Alan Gerber at ISPS, one of my frequent co-authors, has been doing this in the field of medicine, just noting that many wealthy people, when they think about could you obtain a medical specialist by calling someone, and the answer is yes. So wealthy people have it much easier in terms of access to these services. But when you think about immigration and green energy, it's notable that yes, it's very popular with middle class and upper middle class, or upper middle class, I would say. But it's notable that these are areas that have also become popular grassroots in the Democratic Party, even among like labor unions and farther down the food chain, we would think of it, on the left. So I don't think it's fair to say that those are things purely being pushed on the left by people at the economic elite level. They are more popular. And what's interesting is there is a larger question of whether or not, from a campaign strategy standpoint, that has been a way for Democrats to succeed, which is to attract votes of upper income people who, 40, 50 years ago, you were much more likely to be a Republican if you were wealthier. That income gradient has flattened a lot. It's not just that lower middle class people have become more Republican, it's also that upper middle class people have become more Democratic. And arguably that's because of policies like immigration and green energy, where they have preferences.
So I think it's a very astute question. I actually think back to what, to this day, I think is one of the more effective political ads I've seen in a presidential campaign cycle, albeit it was a failing presidential campaign. But it was the Ted Cruz primary campaign back in 2016. I don't know if you remember, it was the fall of 2015 before Donald Trump started running away with the primaries. And the Cruz campaign had this very powerful visual, visceral ad where they go down to the US-Mexico border, and instead of kind of the typical images of the caravans with the cartels, whatever, it was a lot of businessmen in suits with like briefcases like running across the border. And the whole point of the ad was exactly what you're saying there, was that, what if our reckless immigration policy were to actually affect the people that are in New York, that are in DC, that are calling the shots, that are making the decisions and so forth there. So I 100% think that there is a lot to be said for this. I am, generally speaking, a big proponent of the make them feel the pain school of thought, which seems to be kind of what you're getting at there. For instance, I live in Florida. I'm a big fan of our governor, and I was a huge fan of his Martha's Vineyard stunt, whatever you want to call it, a couple of years ago. I was a robust defender of it at the time there. I say that as someone, by the way, whose uncle has a house in Martha's Vineyard. But like, I don't care. I mean, that's exactly who you want to make feel the pain, right? I mean, this is kind of, yes, it's obviously making a political statement. I'm not like obviously transparently making a political statement if you're Ron DeSantis gearing up for a presidential campaign. But on the other hand, if you are trying to expose kind of what the people in the Rio Grande Valley, an 80 to 90% Mexican part of Texas that is rapidly accelerating towards the political right, towards the Republican Party there. If you want to give a snippet of what people like what they are feeling to elite circles there, you certainly could do a whole lot worse than Martha's Vineyard. And if memory serves, I don't remember the exact details, but it was a fairly paltry number of migrants who actually made it to Martha's Vineyard. I think it was like 50 to 60, 65 at the most there. And if memory serves, the residents were not particularly happy about it. So I think that was a well-accomplished political stunt.
Just a brief two-finger, which is I do believe that the Portuguese Refugee Association took them in because there was but it's only 40 or 50.
Okay, got it. Even smaller.
Thank you very much. My name is Will Barbie. So my question, I suppose to both of you, but specifically to you, Mr. Hammer, is related to the current moment that we're in right now, where I think generally people are feeling as though the government has a pervasive unprofessionalism in it, particularly, following things like the signal gate, right, as it has been lovingly dubbed. And so I'm just wondering if you think that this kind of recent displacement of a ruling class in America will lead to better political change, it'll make the ruling class that we had originally change for the better, or if you think it'll lead to broader sort of collapse, unprofessionalism, et cetera.
Okay, so a couple ways to go about answering that. So let's take a step back a little bit there. If you accept my premise that there is a ruling class, one, and that two, this ruling class has generally, not entirely, because that would be overstepping my claim, but has generally led America in a less than ideal direction, then you have a couple of options for what to do forward. One is to kind of do more or less what my friend Rod Dreher did in his book, The Benedict Option, from 8 years ago now, and basically say that you should try to self-silo yourselves and basically just get out of it. Just try to get out of the morass the best you can. Go into your kind of modern day monasteries, or not literal but proverbial monasteries, things like that. They're basically just seclude from society. That ends up being completely unsustainable, unfortunately. So another idea, and probably the more promising one, is to build something along the lines of a counter elite. And this counter elite can be formed, on the one hand, potentially through new institutions, the proverbial and or literal Hillsdale colleges of the world, places like that, or perhaps by just trying to actually just find people who are, to use the term that I've used before, class traitors. I've described Donald Trump as a class traitor. He's the quintessential class traitor. This is someone who grew up wealthy, who has made oodles and oodles of money there, has the Ivy League degree, and he is a traitor to his class. He has held heterodox stances on issues near and dear to his class, such as the trade issue, going back to his earliest days in the public sphere there. So what Donald Trump seems to have done here with his allies, people like Elon Musk, David Sachs, people like that there, is they basically formed a counter-elite of self-professed class traitors there. Now, a lot of the times, these folks do not have, shall we say, a lot of experience when it comes to the day-to-day, operations of actually running the corridors of power there. Personally, I am still optimistic. I mean, we're here barely over 2 months into this administration there. I mean, there's going to be growing pains there. I'm generally a fan, personally, of the overwhelming majority of what this administration is doing, not of all of it. I happen to think that, for instance, the tariff policy is a little scattershot, shall we say. I don't really know what we're talking about. We're talking about annexing Canada. That strikes me as profoundly idiotic and stupid, and it should have stopped a very long time ago. So I'm not going to defend everything they're doing there. But when you're trying to displace, crudely speaking, one elite class with kind of this new counter-elite, there's definitely going to be things that go awry. My hope and my cautious optimism is that these mistakes, such as signal gates mentioned, will be learned for, and hopefully this won't happen again.
Let me take a slightly different take on this, which is imagine that you had a group of people that you wanted to displace the ruling class with. Yes, I don't think there's a ruling class, but imagine you thought there was and you wanted to replace them. What characteristics would you like them to have besides to agree with you ideologically? So let's just posit that you could find a group of people you agreed with ideologically and you wanted them to become the next ruling class to create the good world and good society in which we live. So I think, and I'd be curious, I think we'd probably agree that we'd want them to be hyper competent, we'd want them to be hyper loyal, we'd want them to be efficacious, and they'd want them to be publicly spirited. And a challenge that is going on is when you're engaging in this activity with people who are zealous, but perhaps some of them, because you have a large crowd, may not share the sense of loyalty or first principles, that there's a possibility you can do things in a ham-handed fashion. And so I think a question is there a way to build a robust alternative team that doesn't sacrifice the qualities that you would want? So that's a good question. And I think that there are programs that exist that try to promote ideological diversity that don't see it as contrary to expertise and excellence and loyalty and all of the other sorts of things. Like you can think of Buckley as a revolutionary in a liberal Yale, although Yale's always struck me as rather conservative, but you could think of this as a place that is trying to create a set of future leaders who are different, but they're conservative, but they share a common set of values. And then the second comment is, and I guess maybe I'm more pessimistic, which is that, firing 10,000 public health employees or whatever else is going on doesn't strike me as getting rid of the part of government that people are actually upset about, or the policies that people are upset about. The danger is there's a whole lot of expertise out there. And I worry that if your goal is to alter the values that are governing trade policy, national policy, immigration policy, that this isn't the right way to achieve it, and that it might be the case that this is a larger marker of having this coalition of people who have very different interests inside of an administration. And some are talking about issue X and some are talking about issue Y, and they're trying to go about this, and it may not be as coordinated as it seems. It is legally innovative. And that's probably one thing I would comment, which is learning that there is this, the Congress has given the president enormous authority over the last 80 years, and the administration is using it efficaciously if the goal is to shrink the size of government and lay people off. You could imagine 4 years from now having a new president who will be able to hire 60,000 people, because that legal authority basis for hiring still exists. They will be able to set different trade policy unless Congress acts. So the political circumstance we're in is a product of political decisions that have been made that have given the president this authority that is being used in the way in which it's being used.
We'll take a few more questions.
Thank you for coming out and for the debate. I guess my question is maybe by definition the answer is yes, but I think there's a question behind the question, which is the ruling class, if you think it exists, or if you don't think it exists, then we might refer to it as the Washington Consensus, but is the ruling class currently in power? That's it.
I would argue no. I mean, that's the entirety. To me, that is the raison d'etre. That is the entire purpose of Donald Trump coming down that gilded escalator in 2015. I say that, by the way, as someone who did not support him in either the 2016 or the 2024 primary. I have my own idiosyncratic, at times, misgivings about him. But I think that he is directionally completely on point here when he is running as, again, to use this somewhat evocative phrase, as a class traitor, as someone who has been nurtured and can't come up through the ranks of the various gatekeeping institutions there, but has arrived at a profoundly different conclusion there, as someone who, again, whatever his various shortcomings may be, has an undeniable love at a very visceral level of this country. And there is this delta, this chasm, that I think that you can identify between the way that what I call the ruling class has led and the manner in which they've led with that kind of visceral love of the country. That delta and chasm is kind of what this gentleman was getting at earlier, like this notion that the policies are not necessarily done with kind of this concrete focus on what is best for the proverbial common man, or what is best, frankly, just for the common good, the general welfare, and so forth as well there. So, clumsily or ham-handedly, imperfectly, whatever adverb I guess you want to use, it does seem to me that the entire MAGA, America First, Donald Trump phenomenon, whatever you want to refer to it, is getting at that there. Now, having said that, let me caveat my answer by saying that the optics of this are interesting insofar as, quite literally, the wealthiest man in the entire world is leading this massive downsizing of government. It's actually, frankly, quite ironic, isn't it? Because Donald Trump runs as this nationalist, populist guy who doesn't really care for slashing entitlements, Paul Ryan style. He has no particular interest in libertarian economics there. And somewhat ironically, his administration is now in the midst of overseeing a historic reduction in the size of government, assuming that Congress can lock in some of these gains in the annual appropriations process. Easier said than done. So there's a lot of interesting trends going on right now. I personally am not a libertarian. Shrinking governments to be small enough to drown in a bathtub, as Grover Norquist famously said there, that's frankly not my number one priority when it comes to my public spiritedness. So I'm generally sympathetic to a lot of what Doge is doing, but I'm not kind of a blind follower of it either there. But to your question, the ruling class, as I have defined it, is not necessarily in power because they are trying to do things that the ruling class ideology has done the opposite of for many decades, such as neoliberal absolutism in trade policy, such as recklessness when it comes to the U.S.-Mexico border, and so forth.
I would just agree that I think the fact that a different set of people are in charge wouldn't surprise us because we've seen this before. If you think of Bush II's first administration, it was a very different set of people who were in charge than during Bush I's term in office. And so I think the ruling class actually changes. It's a different set of actors. There's remarkable continuity in certain areas, and there are areas of vast consensus in American politics, but the contested sides and the coalitions that presidents bring, they're going to bring different groups to bear. And the world is changing simultaneously. So it's not an accident to me. So that's one of the reasons I think the premise that there is a ruling class is a little strange. Yes, they're often educated in similar institutions, but they're very different in terms of the things they bring to bear. I'm much more skeptical of the notion that there's a continuing consensus about the right economic policy, for example.
So this is primarily a question for Mr. Hammer. So it seems like you both agree that the American people is unhappy about the American government, or whatever we call it, ruling class. But I wonder if this unhappiness reflects a failure of the ruling class or some failure on the part of the American people. I mean, it looks like the American people wants very many incoherent things. Like it wants domestic manufacturing, but also cheap consumer prices. It wants, during COVID, it wants to save lives, but also save their freedom. It wants global leadership without the burdens of global leadership. So is there something wrong with the American people, what they desire? It's impossible to satisfy. There's no such government that can satisfy this own incoherent set of preferences.
Okay. Interestingly framed question. So look, public polling on any number of issues has been completely over the map for any number of decades there. The abortion issue is all over the map, historically speaking. People call themselves pro-life, but what does pro-life actually mean? Pollsters can always manipulate their polls to reach a desired result. This is kind of the dirty little trick of public polling. I mean, what's the famous Mark Twain quote? There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. I mean, that is about as true in my entire adult lifetime of following political polling as anything else there. So I frankly don't blame necessarily the American people there. That's kind of just the nature of having an ideologically vast array of pollsters that are going to phrase their questions in various different manners to try to please their clients, frankly, whoever the polling firm's actual clients are. That's actually what's driving a lot of these polling decisions there. Having said that, you can identify some broader trends here over the course of decades here. And the immigration issue is probably the best example of this. The American people, for a very, very long time, especially over the past decade, but for a very long time, have consistently told pollsters that they do not want more immigration to this country. That currently, ever since the Hart-Sellers Act comes into power in 1965, there's been a rough baseline of about 1 million new legal immigrants a year. It fluctuates in a given year, but that's kind of the rough number, the rough baseline there. And for a very long time now, most American people say that it should either stay the same or be reduced. But that's not what you hear, frankly, from most elected officials for a very long time of both parties, perhaps until very, very recently. You know, I think back to I mentioned Ted Cruz earlier. I certainly like Ted. I ghost wrote Ted Cruz's book in 2020. I like Senator Cruz, but you know, he said something at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in his very first year as a senator back in 2013, where he basically dumbed down his stance on immigration to illegal immigration, I'm against; legal immigration, I'm for. And with all due respect, Senator, you know, that's not necessarily the actual, that's not really kind of where the American people are. That's probably not where his own constituents are. But this really was, frankly, even the Republican Party's kind of a public-facing stance, again, until Donald Trump comes down that gilded escalator and shatters that consensus. So there are certain trends, I think, that you can identify. The immigration issue would be one, where the American people, frankly, just overall want less of it. That trend has definitely kind of accelerated over the past decade or so there. So yes, the polling is all over the map, but I definitely don't blame the American people for that. That's kind of just the nature of political polling and how polling firms work there. But again, I do think that certain trends are discernible over the long term. You're totally right to recognize some underlying incoherence and inconsistency there, but nonetheless, deducing broad trend lines I think are possible.
In my day job, I study public opinion, and so one of the things I will say is public opinion is more stable than politics. So remember, we've had 4 really close presidential elections, and we see massive swings in policy that aren't reflected in the electorate, because the electorate's view is about what the electorate's view was 8 years ago on abortion. They're kind of moderate, but depending on left or right winning, policy moves left or right much further than that because you have a winning coalition. One challenge with public opinion is if you ask people to give you their opinion, they will. You know, if I asked you what we should do, you'll tell me. But fortunately, the American public are smarter than that, and they know that they don't know a lot of stuff. So I can actually ask the American public, how much capital should a bank be required to set aside if it's going to engage in derivatives trading? And they'll tell me. But then I'll follow it up with a question, which is, how confident are you in your view about this issue, this issue, this issue, this issue? And it turns out people know they don't know anything. And there are lots of issues like that. That's one of the reasons politics is hard, because people have preferences over outcomes, but not policies. And the government produces policy, and outcomes are often distant from those policies. So I would say that it's not unreasonable that people are all over the map, because the world is big and complicated. The political system tries to reduce that, but it reduces it in a way where you get a binary choice, and with parties that are somewhat ideologically distant, it shouldn't surprise us that policy moves back and forth. It's not that people move that much back and forth, it's that you make a binary choice and you get a bundle on the left or a bundle on the right.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. This is a question more for Mr. Hammer. Do you think libertarianism is alive and well, or do you think it is dead?
Very pointed question. You know, I was a chairman of my conservative debating society back at the University of Chicago, and without elaborating, there were certain songs that in our merrier moments we would like to sing. Actually, our society was actually modeled on the YPU, the Yale Political Union. And one of our songs that we enjoyed singing was literally titled, "God Rot Ye Libertarian." So I'm not a fan of libertarianism. I think that libertarianism, you know, this gentleman here sitting in the front row has my new book that just came out a few weeks ago. And I totally excoriate libertarianism in one of the earlier chapters as being anti-humanistic, as failing to understand the human condition, being completely anti-biblical, frankly, in its broader outlook, anti-Judeo-Christian. So I have no love for this ideology whatsoever. However, ironically, to get back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, one could argue that the whole Doge Elon Musk phenomenon has potentially kind of brought a spark back into the libertarian movement. And not necessarily in a bad way here. I mean, who am I to tell Elon Musk and his team of nerds there at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building that they are wrong to save the American taxpayer, X knows how many $1 million when it comes to funding DEI in Burma or whatever. I mean, who am I to say that that's wrong? I mean, I support that, obviously. So, I mean, when the libertarian impulse is channeled in a direction that is broadly popular and conduces to the common good, then I support it. I do think that the general direction of the American right is moving in a more consolidationist, nationalist direction that kind of undergirds libertarianism at its foundation. So one could easily argue, but perhaps it will be the case, that the whole Elon Musk Doge phenomenon will kind of be an aberration, an outlier in a broader trajectory. In fact, if I were placing a wager, I probably would wager that. But nonetheless, it is ironic that the whole Doge phenomenon has nonetheless slightly rejuvenated this otherwise moribund movement.
I think libertarians have to pick a team, right? And ironically, if your goal is let's get rid of NASA, let's buy SpaceX, you've replaced government employees with private contracting, which is a different business. If your goal is just less government, that's a different, it's not reducing the scope of the regulatory state, it's probably just reducing your taxes. So it's a very narrow slice of libertarianism that's winning at the moment.
All right, we'll take one more question. If no one has any more questions, I can ask a quick, oh.
So one way to understand the question of this debate is whether a specific set of ruling elites has failed us, or whether our institutions as a whole have failed us. I'm curious about your thoughts about that, either of you.
You want that?
You can go first. I don't know I have to think about how to answer the question.
So the question is, have a given set of ruling elites failed, or have institutions failed, or some combination thereof?
You answered earlier that essentially the incumbent elites have been discredited and they've been replaced by the MAGA elites. But another way to think about it is that given the institutions that we have, like regardless of who's in power, there's some structural sense in which like they're incapable of handling the problems that we face. So is that closer to your view, or is it simply that basically if it's something narrower, then you've essentially already conceded that the ruling elites you're talking about are in fact no longer the ruling elites?
Yeah, so I mean, insofar as I understand your question, there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem here, right? I mean, I think the question is, did the ruling elites dominate the institutions and take over the institutions, or did the institutions then kind of inculcate certain values in the elites and produce a certain set of elites? So you have a little bit of a chicken or an egg quandary here. It depends how far back you want to go, I guess, right? I mean, you know, the Italian Marxist theorist Gramsci famously has his line about the so-called long march through the institutions, and certainly as recently as 5-10 years ago, arguably still today, but that seems to be changing day by day in real time, you could argue that this ideology, as I have described it, has largely succeeded, frankly, in its long march through all the various institutions. Again, that's starting to unwind a little bit there. So the question is then, if the actual problem is this ideology, ruling class ideology, then what is the actual origins of that there? I don't know that I have a great answer, to be honest with you. I'm not sure whether I can kind of pinpoint a specific time and say this is where it started there, and the problem was a given set of elites who then came to dominate the institutions, or the institutions kind of en masse kind of brought up there. I do, you know, the next historical point prior to 1989 and the Berlin Wall fall, the prior historical point that I oftentimes talk a lot about, and Greg actually alluded to this earlier when he mentioned the post-war consensus, I actually think about the end of World War II a lot here. It seems to me like American elites, American leaders in New York, D.C., frankly misunderstood in many ways the meaning of the Allied victory in World War II. And what I mean by that is that this kind of morally empty liberalism on both ends of the political spectrum comes to dominate there. And I think what happened was, in retrospect, it seems to me that, and I obviously was not alive at the time, but it seems to me like a lot of elites on both sides became convinced that because the totalitarian ideology of Nazism had been defeated, this all-encompassing form of fascism, therefore it's only logical that the exact antithesis was the reason that we won, this kind of morally hollow, morally neutral, live and let live liberalism, this public manifestation of kind of just let the chips fall where they may, whether it comes to economic theory, whether it comes to legal theory and so forth there. And that in many ways was kind of the predecessor to this ruling class ideology that I'm describing today there. So I think a lot about that there. That still doesn't really answer your question, to be honest with you, and I apologize for that, because I don't really know what the answer is. But I'm kind of just thinking it through in real time.
I guess my reaction would be neither, which is to say that one set of elites has lost and been displaced. It's not clear what the long-term future of the left and the right look like ideologically to me, and what those coalitions will look like. It also seems to me that elite institutions have done a remarkable job over the last 100 years of adapting to modernity and adapting to the changing world. There was a time when Yale shut down its engineering departments, believing that you didn't need to teach science to college students because you were going to go off and lead by reading, you know, the classics, and that would enable you to engage with the world. It was a very narrow view of what a liberal education would be. And I think we've seen most parts of society adapt in a way that has been beneficial. It is not to say there hasn't been overreach. You can think of Woodrow Wilson as president of Princeton University writing letters to admitted black students saying it'd be better if they didn't come. And you can think of cases on campuses that suggest violations of free speech and an inability to engage in serious debate. So I think you're seeing a remarkable adaptability, and there is a tendency to read a lot into single election results, which determine who gets to run the government for some period of time. It's not clear what the long-term consequences of the current moment are. I would say there's one area where I fully agree with Josh, which is that there are moments in which policy becomes disconnected from public opinion, and two things can happen. That can happen for two reasons. One is the world can change, and I think in some ways immigration is a case in which the policies that admitted large numbers of immigrants and the trade policies were successful, but the world has changed. The economy has changed. Many things have changed that have changed people's preferences, and the political system has been a little slow to adapt, but a little slow to adapt, which is, I don't think we're going to go back to something that we saw a decade ago, but I don't think you're going to see zero immigration. You know, then we'll look like Italy or other countries that are shrinking and don't have enough babies. So there's a whole question of what the equilibrium will be, and I guess I'm more hopeful that we'll see moderation in both directions.
Thank you. We'll finish with closing statements, starting with Mr. Hammer.
2 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you again so much for having me here. Wonderful conversation for sure. Great questions, as always, from the Yale students. So I guess if I could summarize my argument in a couple of easy kind of takeaway lines for you guys. One is that the ruling class ideology, which is an ideology of free minds, free markets, and free movement of labor, capital, goods, and all the above there, and on the foreign policy stage, the freedom agenda was forged out of the crucible of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the defeat of communism, and kind of the coming into power of the unipolar moment, where the United States has just completely dominated there and sought really to impose and project its values. That era is fundamentally over. That era has been defeated to the extent that it was ever ascendant there. There have been any number of paroxysms, frankly, from people all throughout the world to signify that this era is over, whether it is Brexit back in 2016, whether it is the election of national populists far and wide, like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Bolsonaro in Brazil. Frankly, just yesterday we saw the befuddling arrest, shall we say, of Marine Le Pen in France. It was looking like she was polling to potentially win the next French election. So there's too many examples to count there, but the people are rising up in arms to reject the globalism that has been sold them. And the age of nationalism really is upon us, and that's going to take on various hues when it comes to economics. You see a lot of that with this admittedly at times scattershot tariff policy. I think another thing is kind of what a less ruling class, less freedom agenda-esque foreign policy might look like there. This is kind of a pro-nation state foreign policy. So for instance, in my mind, a pro-nation state nationalist foreign policy would have the United States rely on largely self-sufficient, independent nation states who are not necessarily there to exist as provinces of the American empire, but as independent nation states who we can actually count on there. yeah, perhaps in a crass manner, this is kind of what J.D. Vance was getting at in his Munich Security Conference speech that really kind of caused a lot of people to lose their everlasting minds a few weeks ago there. He's basically saying, you guys are not currently independent nation states. You are kind of provinces of the American empire there. So we're living in an interesting era where a lot of these former orthodoxies are being challenged and frankly just being kind of thrown overboard on a seemingly day-to-day basis there. But the American people have spoken up. They are not happy with how the American ruling class is led when it comes to neoliberal absolutism, when it comes to a swashbuckling neoconservative foreign policy, when it comes certainly to the COVID-19 pandemic there. And we have to live in a more pragmatic, practical day and age. If that entails a new counter-elite, then that is fine there. There's going to be some day-to-day kind of growing pains from this counter-elite there, but fundamentally I think that is probably the best direction and the most promising in the long term.
So I think I'd return to what I said in my initial set of remarks. I don't disagree with certain of the characterizations that Josh makes about the nature of American public opinion. I think the one thing I would just say is that I don't think there's a ruling class. I think it's an open, porous group of people acting on government, and it changes over time. And you see different coalitions ascended at different points in time, and you see variation in what the elite consensus was. I mean, for me, a key sticking point is 9/11, and I remember walking in to teach Intro to US Government on the morning of 9/11. This is before you all had cell phones, and walking in and telling undergrads, oh, the World Trade Center has fallen, because there were no TVs in the dorms at Yale in 2001. And so that changed people's views about would we all live in a world society in which everybody would just come to a common set of values. And we see follows up with the resurgence of Russia. We see follow up with the rise of China, a doubt about this notion that globalism is going to bring peace in and of itself. I think that ideology has fundamentally been challenged for more than 15 years, maybe even 25, 20 years or so. So it's been going on, then it's been contested. I think one very important question, which is a policy question, not an ideological question, but a policy question is, can you have a less globalist world that produces more equitable growth and wealth for a society, or is that a mission that's doomed to fail? Much like you see in much of Africa, where you had nationalist economic policies that didn't produce growth and didn't produce equality. And so that's not a question that I'm equipped to answer, but I think it's a question of whether or not there is a tool to satisfy uncertainty and unhappiness about the current world, or if it's a feature of the world that policy can't fix. And that's actually something we're going to get to experiment with. Can you unilaterally enact high tariffs and expect it to produce a change in domestic economy? That's an empirical question, not a normative question. We're going to find out. And it's the reason you get to play the game, and it's also something where I don't have enough confidence to say I know the right answer, but I'm pretty sure no one really knows the right answer on this. We're going to get to experience it.
Well, thank you both very much. If you could please join me in thanking our guests.
Yeah,